Okay. Okay, so I'm Lizz Mullis,
And I'm Tiffany Walton.
and we're the filmmakers for Invisible Roots, which is a short film that we made in 2014, which we're gonna screen for you. And we only thought that we were just gonna be screening the film, so we didn't prepare a lot for this. So feel free to ask us like any questions that you have, and we will hopefully have answers.
And just to give a background, we made this film in December 2014. I was a grad student at USC, and Liz was undergrad.
Yeah.
And we met in a documentary filmmaking class, and the class was open to any topic that we wanted to, make a film about. And I love African history. I've always kind of been a student of the African diaspora, and I had learned about Afro-Mexicans years before when I was in high school, and was just always fascinated with the topic. And so I knew that there were Afro-Mexicans living in Pasadena and other parts of Southern California, and so I decided to make a film about that, and Liz was very interested in being involved, and so that's kind of how it developed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we could turn off the lights, I guess we will show the film.
So we're open to questions. There's several. And in the research, it was interesting. I was on Facebook and I found a lot of different areas. There's actually several cities named after African nations. Wow. I wish I had refreshed myself. I apologize. Had refreshed myself on some of the names, but some of them were like Mozambique, several African nations. There's a lot of cities named after these African places. So there are some places in northern Mexico, definitely Costa Chica, places that are closer to obviously the Caribbean, like Puerto Morelos area, kind of Cancun area.
One on the other coast, like Veracruz.
Oh, Veracruz, yeah, very much. Like Veracruz is more on the East Coast, and then Costa Chica, of course. So those are like the main concentrations, but all over Mexico. And in our research, at one point, Mexico had more Africans than they had Spaniards or natives. So, it's definitely sprinkled all about in everyone's blood over there. So, yeah. Yes. Yes. I'm just going to wheel this little baby over here.
They couldn't put trigueño or another classification because of the, people who don't say I'm that,
Even like, Dominican Republican, that very much, Dominicans are very much like, they're white. They look like me, so that they're white, which is very interesting.
There's a good series, Black in Latin America, but
Yes.
refers to all those things. So how do you conquer these things? We educate our family.
I'm sorry, you said how do we conquer these things?
Well, if you can give some example, what approaches you use, these things are part of this, how do you, respect and value your identity?
Well, I think that this film is just one small way, of kind of starting the conversation or keeping the conversation going. I'm Black American. My dad's family, they're from Panama, but they moved to Alabama. So, they just consider themselves to be Black American. Certain celebrations will say, oh, we're Panamanian, we're Hispanic, but we identify as Black, but, and my mom's family is just Black American. But I think the conversation is just, I think a lot of people, they're uncomfortable with it because it's outside of their reality, they've never imagined that people can be, Black and Latino. For some reason, there's a disconnect. And it's kind of interesting, even for me, like I used to live in New York and I would see Black people speaking Spanish and I'm like, oh my God, they're speaking Spanish. And I'm like, well, I have this in my family, so why is it so weird for me? And there's just something, I think there's been propaganda, like the lady was mentioning, not until like 1956, this information was not out there. So it's been something that's been hidden. And I think in part, because I used to get really upset and, why aren't these people considered Latino and what's this issue here? But I think a lot of it had to do with survival. If you said you were Black, you could be killed, and a lot of Dominicans, the President Trujillo? Yes, yes. There was this, something I just became aware of recently, the Parsley Massacre. So there was a whole divide, like the Haitians and Dominicans, if you said that you were Haitian or Black, you would be killed, so a lot of this had to do with survival, so I think there's, obviously people are ashamed, and things like that, but I think a lot of it, at the crux is a lot of survival, so, yeah.
I really enjoyed the movie. I think, and perhaps something for you guys to think of as a follow-up, I think a really interesting thing that is kind of in the background of a lot of the comments here is it also shows you how kind of like the U.S.'s race politics have kind of codified people into certain categories, right? So as interesting as is hearing how a lot of the people in your film kind of identify themselves, I found really interesting too the fact that people are constantly telling, oh no, you're not that. Yeah. You're this other thing. You're not that. You're this other thing. And I think that that's a really interesting topic. I don't know why in the United States there's so much talk about multiculturalism and diversity and nothing but they're incapable of thinking that in Mexico or in other parts of the world, the same exact things were going on and for the same reason, right? For colonialism. It brought African slaves, it brought Chinese indentured workers, it brought, Japanese farmers later on. And so it is not uncommon for somebody in the US to be black or be Asian and say I'm an American, but it's somehow outside of the US's scope that you can have somebody who is Afro-Mexican or Japanese Brazilian or Chinese Peruvian or so forth.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Couple questions. I don't know what you guys are planning to do after this, but are you showing this film, especially because of the age of the people that you're interviewing, are you showing it to high schools, middle schools? Are you getting it out there?
Yeah, so we made it a couple years ago, so it's had a long lifespan up until now, and this is kind of like one of our final screenings of the film, because we're both ready to move on to more projects. But yeah, we screened at a couple festivals, and we've gone to different universities around the area, and we've gone to a few smaller.
We went to a lot of schools.
Yeah, a couple elementary schools and stuff like that. Yeah, and we do have an educational distributor through Third World Newsreel. You guys, yeah. So it's still living on, but yeah, that's what we've been doing for the past couple years. So this is kind of like.
What are you individually? Are you moving on in filmmaking? Are you both? What are your?
Well, this was our first film.
Yeah, as you
And
can see.
I am a writer at Mattel, the toy company. So I have a 9-to-5, and I would love to get out of the 9-to-5 life. But so I'm not really pursuing any more film work at this time. And I just had this baby. So he's keeping me very occupied. But I would love to at some point, but just time situation right now. So.
Yeah, and I moved to Chicago a couple months ago to pursue a new documentary project that has to do with like location and art. But I'm definitely, stuff like this that has to do with race and identity is very important to me, and it's important to continue telling those stories. So I'm hoping to come back to this side of storytelling as well. But yeah, documentary to me is hopefully forever. Yeah. Becca?
To kind of piggyback on what he was saying about, like, there is this binarization of race in the United States, you're black or white. Like, there's little in between, so like, where does that leave other immigrants and all that stuff? But like, one thing to think about maybe is also like, in Mexico, in my own research about Son Jarocho and reading black or Afro-Mexican history, which there's a kind of a birth of this, so like, check it out, like Herman Bedet and like some other historians have done some really interesting work about colonial African culture and laws. And so like not until 2015, the pre-census included finally an Afro-Mexican category for Mexico. So 2020 is going to be the first time Mexicans can self-identify in a census.
Wow.
And that's really important to think about how laws force people to categorize themselves. So like in the United States, are you Latino non-white? Or like, are you Hispanic non-white? Like there's this this category. There's no like black and Latino category, So it's interesting how people are forced to self-identify. I don't know if that's like.
People they went to add to that, they just they are organizing a conference between Afro-Mexicans to figure out how they want to be called.
Oh, really?
Like, that's happened.
Wow.
That's
So what did they
interesting.
decide?
No, I mean it's happening, but just the announcement of the conference.
Oh, wow.
We figure out.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
Well, it is funny too that at the American census, when you have to fill something out, it doesn't say check all that apply.
Right.
It can be one. What are you gonna do?
In that conference, the discussion is on Negro o Afro-Descendiente. And I told them that Negro is exclusive, Afro-Descendiente is inclusive.
I'm sorry, you said Afro is inclusive as to.
Afro-descendant.
Afro-Descendant is a term more inclusive.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Inclusive.
Okay.
Because Negro, I recommend you to read
Are you all familiar with Tony Gleaton? He passed away, I think, about 2 years ago, but he was African American from Detroit, and he went throughout Mexico and Latin America, documenting the African presence in those places. And so he was the man who inspired me to do this film. So when you mentioned photos, I thought it might be Tony Gleaton, but he has several, photos that document the African presence.
Can you just repeat the name of your distributor?
Oh, it's Third World Newsreel, and they're based in New York.
And you also were shown through the African Diaspora Film Festival, weren't you?
The Pan-African Film Festival, yes.
But also the African diaspora.
Oh, because there's
Were we?
one
Oh.
Yeah, the one in New York.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know
Tiara
that.
in New York. The one in
Yeah.
New York.
Yeah.
They distributed real estate too.
I was curious about the copyright notice. Was copyright USC?
Yes, USC.
So how does that work? If you did a film as students there, so they own copyright?
Yes, they technically own our film, but we can still distribute it through Third World Newsreel, and we can still show it. But they technically own it because we were students then. So USC just,
But they're pretty nice about it. Like they've let us do more than I think they typically do. I mean, we can't just post it online for anyone and everyone to see. That's one of the biggest stipulations. But aside from that, like we're still getting an audience, so they're not holding us back.
Sorry,
You good?
Thank you so much. I so much appreciate the way that you frame and have the young interviews with young people, and it's such an enigma to me. So I guess my question is, in the need of reclaiming, within this binary of having to really, go back and forth between, Afro-Mexicano, in this need, and a very real need to have to identify and reclaim the Mexican heritage, is it also a rejection? Or how do you, is it a rejection of the African heritage? And is there an interest at all in reclaiming or an investigation of that? And trying to work against the binary, but instead of including that culture as a very, very rich and deep part of the connection. Because seeing here, I see, no, I am this, right? So, they're forced to have to really identify. And that it feels like kind of lost to me. In a way.
That's a great question. Ismar, the young man, the darker skinned man, we had conversations off camera, and he was saying he grew up always thinking he was Mexican. He had no idea he was black. And I was like, Ismar, how could you not know that you were black, And he was like, well, I kind of thought something, but I didn't really know what to think, And there was a man who wrote a newspaper article, and that's how I found out about this community in Pasadena. This is a black man who was a newspaper reporter for the LA Times, and he wrote an article about this community in Pasadena, and then he found Ismar in Santa Ana, which is Orange County. And he educated him and said, you are black, and Ismar rejected it. And it took him a long time to accept the fact that he was black, because he would be beat up, and he was saying that he would be going home from school, and there were several young Mexican guys who were like, stop saying you're Mexican, you are not Mexican, you're black. And Ismar was like, I'm Mexican. And so they beat him until he said that he was black. And so I think kind of from that, he was like, okay, let me try to figure this out, And I know for Ismar is very sensitive and very aware, conscious of a lot of things. And for him, he majored both in Chicano studies and African American studies, because he wanted to try to figure out this thing. So for him, I think it's very important for him to say that he is Afro-Mexican. But he still identifies, as Mexican. And I think that your question is very complicated in the way that you know, as Americans, you know, we can, you know, we're both Americans, you know, I'm Black American, you know, however Liz identifies.
White.
You know, but for some reason in Mexico, you cannot be Black Mexican, you know, you have to, it's either or, you know, and I think that our film is helping to change the conversation and just having more dialogue because it's not this exclusive thing. You can be Mexican, it's inclusive of anything. You can be Chinese, Mexican, you know. So I know a lot of, like Simeon, he was the first man who was saying that his dance troupe, like when they were out, like they made him recite the national anthem and things like that. So him and his wife, we asked them, what does it mean to be Afro-Mexican? What does that mean to you? What does the Afro mean? And he was very proud, like he said, I'm Afro-Mexican. He was very, very proud of it. But when you asked, what does the Afro mean? They didn't really have a concept or they couldn't get deeper. And so we asked his wife, Anna, and she was like, oh, it means like Catholicism and to love God. And we're like, oh, really? You know? And so, you know, they don't really have that deeper understanding. But I think, you know, it was kind of, I don't want to say disappointing, but it was kind of like, oh, we, you know, would love to have more. But I think it's good because it's a growing consciousness. You know, they're growing into it. And, you know, for me, I'm like, I'm Black, I'm proud, you know, whatever. But for them, it's just something that's been so hidden. And it's like this emerging, you know. And so the fact that they're so proud to say that they're Afro-Mexican is the victory, you know. And, yeah. And so I think that they're learning more because we would even say, you know, oh, did you know that, you know, I'm not remembering some of the names, but some of the, a lot of the Mexican men throughout history, a lot of them they've had African blood. And so we said, oh, did you know so-and-so? And they're like, no, you know. And so it's just, sometimes they didn't even know who these people were in general. So it's just the education, and we would ask them, do you know about slavery and things like that? And they were just like, well, we heard that there was like some kind of ship and something happened. So they just don't have that knowledge yet, you know. So I think, and even Crystal, who was the woman in Santa Ana, she was the one, I wish we had a photo. Crystal was the one who had curly hair, and she was a reference point to Crystal.
She was talking about like all the food and like the chilate.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So I met her on YouTube. She had some videos of all these Afro-Mexican parties in Santa Ana. And so I sent her a message just saying, you know, would love to speak to you about, you know, Afro-Mexican culture. And her video said, if you want to learn about Afro-Mexican, culture, like hit me up or something. So I messaged her, and it took her several months to respond. And then when she responded, she was very leery. And that's a kind of a side note. It took a lot of time to get these interviews because the community was very suspicious. You know, they did not want to open themselves up because I think a lot of them are undocumented. And so that was a whole nother thing. And so Crystal identified on YouTube as Afro-Mexican, but then when you speak to her, she's more like, I'm Hispanic, you know. And so it was interesting. We had another conversation, and they go to Mexico like maybe once a year or something. And so in Mexico, she said when she's in Mexico, she feels Black. She feels Afro-Mexican in Mexico, but here she doesn't feel it. And so I said, well, why do you feel Black in Mexico? And she said, because everyone looks like her. They all look Black in her area. So she feels like she can strongly connect to the Afro-Mexicanness, you know, there, but not here. So I hope I answered your question. All around the world, but yeah.
the identity of Latino in American, and that the three
everybody just assumed I was from there. They didn't, I didn't get a problem. But when I go to San Antonio, where I'm from, where my family's been from for centuries, you're automatically like, I don't know, like an outsider because you don't kind of fit the profile. So I don't know. I don't know if that's like, that's my theory. That's like, I even have a friend here who's from Mexico who always tells me, Teresa, stop saying you're Mexican. Stop saying you're Mexican. You're not. I'm like, oh, okay, all right, thanks. I'll write that down in my diary.
And that's, I think, with our film, I don't think initially we were setting out to do this, but it kind of helps maybe to stop some of this policing, because that policing is annoying, and it's I don't think it's correct, I mean, you have to understand it because it's in the scope of how some people, like, I'm sorry that you're so limited in your understanding, so it helps people to expand, their mind. And one of our favorite screenings was in Boyle Heights, which is a traditional, Mexican, Chicano area. And I lived in Boyle Heights when I first moved to LA. And I remember when I moved there, all my black friends were like, we will never visit you there. Like, we do not feel comfortable there. Mexicans do not like us. We will never go. Huh. And so I had no problems at all. But when we went back to film this documentary, I had left like a few years prior, but the documentary at this time, it brought in a lot of Mexicans who have been questioning like whether they might have some black blood in them. So it was good because in LA there is it's a conflict between a lot of blacks and Mexicans. Mm-hmm. And so it was good because a lot of the people, the audience, there were people who wanted to kind of try to bring the communities together, so people used it as a tool, to bring peace and change and things like that, and also to say, hey, I'm Mexican, I was raised Mexican, but my hair is curly, so I've always been trying to figure out why is my hair curly, and so people connected with it because they could see themselves. And there was a woman and her daughter, and they were questioning because they would straighten their hair, but they said, that their hair is very, very curly, and a lot of people think that they're black, and we've always wondered, are we black? And then I think one of the historians mentioned Sinaloa, and that's where their family was from. They were like, oh my God, so this is probably confirmation that we probably do have, black blood in us. So it's good that the film has brought like a lot of, personal kind of connections to people too. So, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just have a comment that I feel from the contrast between the U.S., even like way back then in Blockbuster, to be a member you need to fill this form. And to my shock, we had to, put Black American blood. And I was like, why? But in Mexico, we don't have that. At least, in Blockbuster, So I feel that the consciousness about heritage in the United States is highly giving a lot of attention in the sense of pride and otherness and of course curiosity, but there's so much to it here. And I feel probably to propaganda, government, or just, Mexico, whatever it is. In Mexico, we just tend to be more thinking of us as Mexican, whether in the same, little town we'd be from Yugoslavia and, Polish and French and, all kinds of, but then this brings me to the other question we were talking about the connections between anthropological genetics and rhythm and dance. Mm-hmm. In my family, my father has curly hair. He would always be made fun of because he was like a old washing, And I always felt that my dad would have a Cuban connection, because I love salsa, and I grew up while I was growing up, I was in Savannah when I was 3 years old, and I probably had, a lot of Cuban friends. So that's me, and, I'm darker than the rest of my brothers. I almost have, lighter skin, brown eyes, and my sister, she's blonde and has blue eyes. So then I'm the only U.S. citizen, and every time we would travel as a family, turn their passports to my force, an organization, politically or for any reasons we are, to be focusing the population on differentiating or being part of heritage or genetics or whatever it is, or not. There are connections that maybe we're not forced to or enticed to be more connected with. And it's fascinating in a way that we hope is not as a backlash in Mexico for other purposes, but it brings a lot of awareness to that.
Thanks.
To complicate things further, in terms of how we make those connections, I mean, we're really talking about blood connections, right, in this room right now, right? And yet we also know, right, that there are other kinds of connections, cultural connections that we make that are not, right, that are not blood, right? I don't want to use Rachel Dadziel or whoever she was to like really say that, but white tap dancers who really identify completely in the rhythm tap tradition can be challenged because they're not African American. There have been those dialects that come in. So this whole idea of I don't know, we can talk about gender being culturally constructed, but we don't talk about that in terms of racially. But it is a conundrum because it is like what your soul really becomes attracted to, right? So that even you, Teresa, finding out that it was there, right? Before you found out that you had some West African in you, right? It's like it makes you wonder, like, what was what brought me to that,
For me, it
right?
makes me wonder about my grandmother, who was so paranoid about, like, that's the reason I'm so light, is she was like the story. Oh, your grandmother told you you're lighter skin. And my grandmother told me that, and she used to refer to herself as I'm negra. That's like she would make me put on sunscreen all the time and get mad at my mom if I came back with a tan. So it's like that's that makes me think. I wonder if she knew somehow, because she was so paranoid about that. But she grew up in like the teens and 20s in South Texas, when if you were too dark and you spoke too much Spanish, you could be taken, shipped off to across the border, whether or not you were there, if you were born in America. So I don't know. There's something to that is handed down. And in my case, I think it got handed down as this kind of like self-hatred and kind of paranoia about your identity. So, I don't know.
As Miss Dunham would say, Captain Dunham said, it's more complicated than that. When I interviewed her on her, on Cabin in the Sky, I have, I'm really, one of the great parts of my being a scholar was that I got a chance to really, interview and write about the great Captain Dunham. And I had interviewed her in Cabin in the Sky, which was this 1941 Broadway play that George Balanchine was to direct. He was in the United States only like 3 years speaking Russian, right? And with Duke Dukelsky, who is another Russian designer, and there he is incorporating Captain Dunham and her entire dancing company, musicians, into Cabin in the Sky on Broadway, right? She comes in with all of her dancers, and what did he do? He just like and staged them, right? So this whole interview with her, which I was thrown out to be to say, Miss Dunham, you received credit for all your choreography, Cabin in the Sky, and George Balanchine, took this all from you, and everyone in the dance community hates George Balanchine. Don't you feel cheated? But meanwhile, she had always wanted a ballet naked, right? And that's basically really what he said. Anyway, when I asked her this question, I said, aren't you angry about this? Should we not, and she would say, Constancia, it's much more complicated than that. She said it's more like, having, beating a cake with all its little, nuts in it to make it smooth. But, I'm sorry to say that, but it is. It's just so much more complicated than that. But, says Catherine.
Thank you, you two, so much.
Talking about the connection. School district company invited students, usually made group of
started to participate in a project on the Africa and Latino issue. And I was invited, and they asked me to say Africa and the mariachi. No, that's a joke. No? Remember el son de la negra? El son del maracumbe? And the drumming of the heart? That's Africa.
Right.
That's Africa. A Mexican rejected.
There's also cajón playing in tapeo.